took a bit, but after a teaser 2 years ago in 2020, and nearly 5 years after Forza Motorsport 7 came out, we finally have some concrete info about Forza Motorsport's next entry. In today's video looking at the release footage, we're going to compare the new Forza Motorsport to the last game and look into the feasibility of this game actually running with 4K 60 FPS with real-time ray-traced reflections. Regardless of what platform this footage is running on, that is a tall order to render. But yes, according to Microsoft's blog, all the release footage of the game so far is actually from the PC build of the game. Apparently though, this visual quality that is seen here and running on PC was also tested on the Xbox Series X as well. It's a bit of a jumbled up way of stating it there, yet what we're looking at here is in-game and real-time footage on PC, and that the Xbox Series X version should be very similar. Even with that knowledge though that it is running on PC, the question is still there of how they're doing it exactly. And how is that Xbox Series X will have similar visual quality to what we're seeing here? I mean, not a lot of other racing games do this. Gran Turismo 7, for example, limits its ray tracing to non-gameplay areas and to a limit of 30 FPS. And as we know on PC, ray tracing at 4K is very expensive. Even the best PC GPUs, like you can see here in Cyberpunk 2077, struggle to run at 60 FPS when at native 4K, even when only ray-traced reflections are enabled. Or check out Formula 1 2021 here. This is a racing game like Forza, and it has high-quality ray-tracing reflections. And at 4K, both GPUs are definitely not at 60 FPS. So if these big GPUs can't really do it, what kind of compromises to resolution or reflection quality are they doing here to make it possible? I think looking at the trailers and demo released gives us some hints. And there are two trailers here, by the way. There's this 5-minute long demo shown at the conference and another 1-minute long sizzle reel of sorts that was released separately and I think has a few surprises of its own. But more on that later. First, let's talk about the first clue from the demo, and that is resolution. In the past, Forza Motorsport titles have always targeted native output resolution of the console they are on, with MSAA usually set to 4x. For example, the Xbox One versions of Forza Motorsport were 1080p, 60 with 4 times MSAA. And should they be showing the game off on PC, it was usually 4K with 4 times MSAA, for example. I think Turn 10 may have changed strategies a bit for this rebooted Forza Motorsport. For one, the trailer showcases image quality discrepancies at points that you would not see with MSAA. As the camera swoops around the car here in the pit stop, if you look at the engine detail as the camera is moving around and there's some obscured stuff in the foreground and background, it's possible to see that anti-aliasing doesn't really apply to this detail here. Geometric edges almost look like they have no anti-aliasing. With MSAA, I honestly would have expected some anti-aliasing here. Given this behavior and the general amount of aliasing found all throughout the 5-minute demo, I think we're looking at the indication that Turn 10 are not as reliant on MSAA as they've been in the past. Perhaps they're looking towards other forms of anti-aliasing, which would then greatly save resources versus a high level of MSAA. Secondly, I think perhaps the next Forza Motorsport in this footage is not targeting a traditional 4K as we know it from the series past. For example, at numerous moments in the trailer, there are snippets of the screen that look lower resolution than native 4K. The intro of the demo, for example, even as the camera is sitting still, I think it's really easy to see how these rocks by the water here have low resolution highlights on them and edges that are noticeably sub 4K. When I do try and count these edges, I get half counts as we call them. So 10 edges found out of 20 pixels, which implies a 1080p like resolution for that edge. This can be found a handful of other times in the trailer on pixels that become very bright. At the same time though, there are a lot of shots and edges in this trailer that resolve to a perfectly countable 4K, like you can see here. Making this even more confusing is that there are a few moments in the trailer where recently revealed objects on screen have a very curious pattern of pixels show up in them. Check out this area here. These background pixels on this geometry here was just revealed, and the edges have missing bits in them almost. There's gaps of information there in the rendering. Usually that implies some level of image reconstruction is in play. I will not say I'm 100% certain here, but perhaps we're looking at a form of image reconstruction or another novel technology like variable rate shading, which will make 4K output cheaper in a meaningful way. As the blog and presenters mentioned during the demo, Forza Motorsport is a game that is using forward plus lighting, and forward plus lighting can have a lot of performance to gain from a usage of variable rate shading. But still, even if they're making 4K cheaper with other methods of rendering, ray trace reflections are still incredibly expensive. How are they making ray tracing possible at this high output resolution? There are a couple things here, but one is I think they're using a specific form of ray traced reflections which has a more reasonable performance cost. See, in ray tracing, the more coherent or sharper reflection is, the cheaper it is to render. This applies to all GPU architectures that are currently released, and especially on RDNA 2, which is used in the Xbox Series X. For example, look at this scene here in Ghost Runner on RTX 3080. On the left-hand side, the game is using glossy reflections, so reflections that can be diffuse and soft. They're more realistic to the materials at hand. On the right, though, I've limited the game to more mirror-like reflections. Notice how the metal of the door, for example, has a much more coherent reflection in it, or how the sword in the character's hand has a really obvious, sharper reflection in it in comparison to the left-hand side. On this GPU, a lot of rendering time is saved by using mirror-like reflections, 6 milliseconds at 4K. On an RDNA 2 GPU, going towards mirror reflections has an even greater savings, 10 milliseconds of frame time versus glossy reflections. For this reason, I think that is why all the reflections seen in the 5-minute gameplay demo look very mirror-like. If you check out the reflections on the side of the car here, yep, they look like a mirror. Or check out this inlaid detail of the car, engine, and more. All these surfaces here either have pure mirror-like reflections or no reflections at all. Even reflections for brushed metals are very mirror-like. Take a look at this brake rotor in the car wheel here. There's brushed metal there, I think, but it has a very coherent mirror-like reflection to it. You can really see those reflections of the spokes very clearly. Usually you might expect a surface like this one would have a softer reflection of those spokes. Now here's where I get back to that other 1 minute long trailer. Curiously, if you go to that trailer and not the gameplay demo, and you look at similar detail, you can see that the brake rotor in this car here has a very different look. The metal there has soft reflections of the wheel spokes. They're not sharp and mirror-like. In fact, that 1 minute trailer has a lot of diffuse reflections in it in comparison to the 5-minute demo. I mean, just look at all the soft, diffuse reflections here on this car engine. Is that 1 minute long trailer running at different and perhaps higher quality settings for the ray tracing than the 5-minute long demo? Actually, let me pause the video here for a moment for a rare moment of off-the-cuff dev commentary. I had already finished this video. It was uploaded to the channel and ready to be published. And it was containing this question in it. Does the 1 minute long trailer have better ray tracing settings than the 5-minute long demo? And then out of the blue, Turn 10 actually announce in a stream that this 1 minute long trailer does indeed have better ray tracing quality than the 5-minute long demo. Specifically, they mentioned that replays, garage, photo mode, and more have ray traced global illumination, and I would imagine they also probably have better ray traced reflections in them. And that this 1 minute trailer is made up of shots with those replay mode graphics. That really explains a lot of the shots here, and specifically ones like this one, where the garage door opening shows really obvious bounce lighting and lighting quality that is far in excess of the 5-minute long gameplay demo. This is neat stuff, and I would usually be excited about this inclusion of new technology, but with the reveal of this information, it leads to the awkward situation where the 1 minute trailer, which is presented at 4K and 60 FPS with no image quality faults almost, is tagged as in-game 4K in the bottom corner. In my opinion, in-game is generally understood as meaning in-game play, and not just something that is viewable when the game is booted up. A replay is not the game, and presenting it as such is not very straightforward to the viewer newer, so I'm soured there, honestly. And lastly, hearing this news is awesome from a technology perspective, but now I'm also kind of worried about the PC version based upon this statement. They mention RT Global Illumination is limited to replays, photo mode, etc., and is not on track like the ray trace reflections will be. But honestly, there's no reason to limit RTGI to photo mode and replays on PC. PC is an infinitely scaling platform into the future. Next-gen GPUs are just around the corner even. So let's hope that there's a way to force RTGI on track as an option on PC. Okay, enough of this out-of-character commentary, and now back to your regular Digital Foundry programming. Okay, so enough about how they got this running with ray tracing, and let's talk a bit more about some of the cool non-ray tracing things that have been added to Forza Motorsport here. And I think that's really well illustrated by going back and comparing to Forza Motorsport 7. This was a competent looking game at the time of its release, but I definitely think it's very limited by the base Xbox One that it also had to target. In FM7, time of day is completely static. Some tracks only have two choices, with or without rain. In the new Forza Motorsport, the time of day can change. This means that they're having to relight the game in real time in some fashion. And I imagine this is something that is not at all possible in any real way at 60 FPS on a base Xbox One. And while we're looking at this time of day change here in this shot, let us look at the trackside detail differences. Here's an area where FM7 had to compromise a lot. The game had to keep the car models on screen in front of you reasonably detailed. So sideline areas outside the track had to be pared back and more sparsely detailed. In comparison, the new Forza Motorsport is bustling with tons of more spectators and individual models. A similar difference is now seen in vegetation as well. In the original game, trees on the side of the road are more or less 2D cutouts that lack proper self-shadowing. Smaller details are missing entirely as well. In the new Forza Motorsport, the trees are actually 3D models with individual 3D branches that cast proper real-time self-shadows. And the rest of the terrain as well is broken up by smaller rocks and tiny grass missing in the older game. When taken as a whole, there is indeed a magnitude of difference in trackside detail visible in this new Forza Motorsport versus the last one on the same stage. Fields were basically just textures before, but now you can see individually modeled vegetation there. And if we zoom into this new trackside detail, we can also see some other upgrades to the game. In Forza Motorsport 7, trackside detail tended to be rather simplistically shaded. Take this plastic cone here, for example. If you look at the shading on the plastic versus the shading on the concrete below it, you can actually see that the material values there are very similar. The plastic cone itself does not really have the material look it should have. If you look at a similar area in the new game, you can see more material variation. The road and cone are now shaded differently, and importantly, the cone's plastic acts more like you would imagine, where you can see a simulation of subsurface scattering on the thinner areas of plastic, so light is being transmitted through the plastic to the other side. Given a detail difference like this one, which is rather stark, I'm very curious how other aspects are going to be handled in the new game when you get up close. Crowds, for example, what do they look like up close? Or pit stops. We've only seen glimpses of these things in the footage so far. To conclude this short look into the new Forza Motorsport's released footage, I would say that there are some very meaningful upgrades to the visuals here that are immediately apparent. And given what we've seen of image quality and the nature of the ray traced reflections here, I don't think it's too far-fetched that we're seeing the game running on hardware at 4K 60 FPS. At the same time, there's a number of questions that are still present as a result of this footage. Sure, we've seen the game at 4K 60 with RT reflections on a PC here, but can we expect similar levels of image quality and performance there on Xbox Series X? Or will there be compromises beyond what is visible in this demo? And what about Xbox Series S? The commenters of the demo actually expressly mentioned the Xbox Series S when talking about ray tracing. So how exactly will ray tracing run and look there? Ray tracing is becoming rare on that console, and a lot of other developers are dropping it entirely from their releases. It'll be interesting to see what Turn 10 manages there on that smaller console. But that is enough from me for now. I think we're still going to wait a little bit here to get a more complete picture of this game on all the platforms it's releasing on. If you did find this look into Forza Motorsport's gameplay to be interesting, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as DF posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years worth of our content in high quality for download. Other than that, write a comment below, follow on Twitter, and as always, this is Alex bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.